Some truths are buried not in earth, but in the quiet places where memory dares not go. Tonight's mystery begins in the dim parlours of Eastwood House, where a vanished child, a sealed study, and a ledger stained with silence await the eye of a man who sees what others dare not speak. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Let us step through the fog and into the confession no one was meant to hear. The morning had broken soft and grey, as so many had that November, the fog drifting in slow ribbons past the bow windows of Baker Street and muffling the clatter of hoof and wheel with a curious gentleness. Holmes, half stretched upon the settee, was immersed in a monograph on obscure Chinese poisons, while I, fresh from a restless night, occupied myself with the Times, though gleaning little from its pages. The mood within our rooms was one of measured quiet. That is, until the bell below gave a sharp and sudden peal. Our landlady, ever discreet, allowed no more than a moment to pass before ushering in a young lady whose bearing, though composed, betrayed a certain tremor of purpose. She was not of a particularly arresting appearance, but the gravity with which she held herself, and more so, the item she clutched, arrested Holmes's attention as if she had entered bearing a pistol. In her gloved hand was a folded letter, the paper yellowed and creased with age, the edges feathered, and the ink visibly blotted in places where, I imagined, a hand unsteady with age or conscience had hesitated. She gave her name as Miss Eliza Greywood, and with a voice low but resolute, declared she had come not for protection, but for clarity. The letter, she explained, had been left among her great-uncle's effects, sealed and addressed not to her, but to Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, to be delivered only upon the writer's death. Her fingers lingered an instant too long upon the envelope as she passed it to Holmes, as though its opening might unseal something within her as well. Holmes turned the envelope over in his slender fingers, reading the address as one might trace a map of someone's final thoughts. He opened it without ceremony, unfolding its contents with an economy of gesture that betrayed the quiet tension in the room. I, seated opposite, leaned forward instinctively, though he said nothing at first. The letter, penned in a tight, laborious script, was clearly the work of a man at the edge of life. Its tone bore no dramatic flourishes, only an insistence, quiet but unrelenting, that there was a matter long buried which demanded the attention of no one less than Sherlock Holmes. The details were scarce, but the phrase, "the truth sealed at Eastwood House," recurred more than once, as did a reference to a study locked for decades and a shame that, in the writer's words, had breathed behind the walls longer than any man should permit it to. The young woman then produced a second object from her reticule, a key. At first glance, it might have passed for any rustic house key, long, forged of iron, its bow fashioned in the older style, and its stem marked with flecks of corrosion, yet something about it caught Holmes's attention at once. He took it up with the same delicacy he had once applied to a scrap of torn cloth that had convicted a man of murder. His fingers brushed over the notches, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in deep, contemplative interest. "It is a curious object, is it not?" I offered as Holmes turned it in the light. "Curious," he murmured, "only in the way that a silence is curious when one has grown too used to its presence. This key, Doctor, is old not merely in age, but in neglect. It has not been used for decades, yet has been preserved with care. That suggests a room forbidden, not forgotten." Miss Greywood said nothing, but her eyes did not leave Holmes's face. There was in her expression no expectation of comfort, only the hope of understanding. At Holmes's invitation, Miss Greywood sat near the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. What she unfolded to us then was not so much a narrative as a series of impressions, a child's recollection grown brittle with time and half filled with shadows. Her great-uncle, Henry Greywood, had been, In his younger years, a man of business and severe demeanour, he had returned to Suffolk in the early 1870s to assume stewardship of Eastwood House following the death of his elder brother. There, he had lived in increasingly strict solitude, growing more taciturn with the years, and rarely admitting visitors beyond the vicar and the local physician. Eliza, as a girl, had spent 3 summers at Eastwood under the care of a governess while her parents were abroad, but she had been barred from entering the west wing of the house, which included the study. Her uncle had once snapped at her for straying too near its door. There was something in his manner, she said, eyes fixed not on us but on the firelight, a kind of mournful vigilance. He would walk the corridor outside that door late at night. I heard him, once, whispering, not to himself, but as if answering someone. When I asked him the next morning who lived in that part of the house, he looked at me for a long time and said, "No one lives there, and no one must." The study had remained locked until his death some weeks prior. In his final hours, he had muttered repeatedly of a wrong unrighted, of a truth waiting behind iron and dust, and insisted that only Sherlock Holmes might see the thing through. Among his papers, the letter and the key had been discovered, left not in his writing desk but sewn into the lining of his old travelling coat. At the close of her account, Miss Greywood looked not to Holmes, but to me. "I do not know what you will find there, gentlemen," she said quietly. "I only know that something was hidden, not from the world, but from the man who kept it." Holmes, who had listened without interruption, now leaned forward, his fingers steepled and his gaze fixed. The flicker of the fire lent a strange depth to his pale features, and for a moment he looked not so much like a man preparing to solve a mystery, but one about to exhume it. "Miss Greywood," he said at last, "it is a rare thing for a locked door to hold its silence for 30 years. When it does, one must ask, was it silence imposed from within or from without?" She did not answer, and I, for the first time that morning, found myself chilled, not by the air outside, but by the thought of a truth that had waited 3 decades for a key. Holmes had not spoken for some time. He sat as if sculpted in thought, the letter laid open upon his knee, the iron key resting beside it like a relic prized from some crypt. His gaze drifted neither to Miss Greywood nor to myself, but hovered instead somewhere between the hearth and the shadows just beyond it. "It is not the object that interests me," he said at length, his voice no louder than a murmur, "but the manner in which it was preserved." I said nothing, content to watch him think, that particular silence of his, which seemed always to draw the room into it. "This envelope," he continued, tapping it gently, "has been folded and refolded 12 times, perhaps more. One might imagine it lay forgotten in a drawer, yet here." He lifted the letter slightly. "We find the creases arranged not with indifference, but with care. There is almost a reverence in the way it was folded, as one might fold a page of scripture one could not bear to destroy, yet feared to read again." He turned his attention to the key. "Here is a thing meant not for daily use, nor for discard. It was retained, not misplaced, and kept in the lining of a coat, no less. Not the pocket, mind you, which might be turned out or stolen, but the lining, stitched in, sewn out of sight, hidden not from the world, but from oneself." Miss Greywood had drawn her shawl a little tighter, though the fire had not dimmed. Holmes gave her a sidelong glance. "You do not strike me, madam, as one who traffics in melodrama, and I assure you, my friend Dr. Watson and I are not men who delight in the theatrical. You have not come to us with ghosts or riddles, but with 2 items, a letter and a key. One contains words written in a hand, unready to meet death. The other opens a door that has remained unopened by design, not by neglect." He paused. "And yet," he added, "what most compels me is not the letter, nor the key, nor even the story behind them. It is the tremble in your voice, the note of one who suspects, but does not yet dare to know. Miss Greywood's composure faltered for the first time. Her hands had grown white about the knuckles, and her lips parted, not to speak, but as though robbed of speech altogether. "There is more buried at Eastwood than bricks," Holmes said, and his tone held no accusation, "and I believe the house has waited long enough." The remainder of the morning passed in efficient stillness. Holmes made no grand declarations, nor did he summon Lestrade, the press, or any of the apparatus that had so often followed the scent of crime. Instead, he rose from his chair, donned his coat with the air of one preparing for a walk rather than a case, and began making quiet arrangements for a journey. We were to leave for Suffolk the following morning. A carriage was to meet us at the station in East Wrentham, and from there we would proceed directly to Eastwood House. Miss Greywood, for her part, expressed no protest at our travelling without her. Indeed, I sensed in her a deep relief, as though to have relinquished the matter into Holmes's hands had lightened a burden she herself did not wholly understand. That night, Holmes was quieter than usual. He made no remarks on the weather, nor the news, nor even on the unusually poor quality of my billiards column. Instead, he remained in contemplation, smoking little, speaking less. At one point, I thought him dozing, only for him to murmur without opening his eyes, "Truth, Watson, is a most perishable thing. Like iron left in a locked room, it does not vanish, but it corrodes. And when finally uncovered, it bears the marks not only of what it was, but of what time wished it not to be." It was not a poetic observation, nor did he seem pleased to have made it. Yet something in it chilled me more than the wind rising faintly beyond the glass. We departed with the dawn. The journey into Suffolk was of the sort that invites a man to contemplate not the destination, but the distance between present and past. As our train made its measured way from the soot-stained outskirts of London into the deepening hush of the countryside, I noted the gradual fading of gaslight and chimney pot, replaced by hedgerows that leaned in close, as if guarding secrets of their own. Holmes, for his part, remained characteristically silent throughout. He had brought no book with him, nor did he comment upon the landscape. Instead, he gazed steadily from the window, his fingers idly tracing the edge of the envelope Miss Greywood had delivered, now folded once more and placed in his breast pocket. At East Wrentham we alighted to find the station platform near deserted. Our solitary porter seemed both sleepy and suspicious of our purpose, and Holmes's brief inquiries as to Eastwood House earned only a vague gesture toward the south and the muttered word, "overgrown." A hired carriage conveyed us through lanes that grew narrower and quieter the farther we travelled. Trees arched above like vaulting stone, and the fields we passed seemed not cultivated, but left to dream, thick with grasses untouched by plough or boot, and dotted here and there with the weathered remains of dry stone walls. It struck me as a country not merely rural, but forgotten, as if time had passed it by and it had made no protest. I remarked as much to Holmes, who nodded faintly. "Places, like people, Doctor," he said, "sometimes learn to survive by falling silent." The approach to Eastwood House was so unceremonious that I might have missed it had Holmes not raised a finger. A crooked gate, half swallowed by bramble, stood barely visible behind the sagging fence line. Beyond it, the gravel drive was all but erased by moss and fallen leaf, and the hedgerow to either side had grown so dense that the house itself did not reveal its presence until we were nearly upon it. It was a structure that inspired neither welcome nor fear, merely a deep, leaden stillness. The ivy clung to it in great swaths, obscuring entire windows and winding its way up the stone like a patient strangler. The roofline sloped under the weight of years, and the once white woodwork had surrendered to the same grey as the sky above. Our driver, who had grown steadily quieter as we neared our destination, muttered that he would wait at the lane, and left without further word. Holmes walked to the front gate and examined the lock, which yielded after a brief effort. The hinges groaned not in protest, but with a sort of long-held resignation, as though even they had come to accept their duty had been abandoned. We passed beneath the archway and onto the path, our steps soft upon the moss and damp leaf litter. As we reached the door, Holmes paused to run his gloved hand along the rusted iron of the knocker. His gaze lingered a moment on the stone above. There, faint but still discernible, the family name Greywood was etched. Without ceremony, he turned the key Miss Greywood had entrusted to him in the aged brass lock. It opened at once. The scent within was not foul, but heavy, the unmistakable odour of disuse. Mingled with the faintest trace of lavender long faded. The air did not stir. Holmes stepped forward, allowing a shaft of pale light to stretch inward behind him. We entered into a hallway panelled in dark wood, its once polished surface dulled by a fine layer of dust. The furniture that lined the corridor, a hall stand, a narrow table, a long pier glass, stood as though waiting for occupants who had merely stepped out and forgotten to return. Even the umbrella in the stand and the pair of gloves folded upon the table might have belonged to yesterday rather than 3 decades past. It was the clock that struck me most, a tall casepiece. It stood against the far wall like a sentry fallen asleep at its post. Its pendulum was still, not broken, but stopped. And in that single detail, I felt more acutely than ever that this was not a house abandoned, but paused. We moved carefully through the drawing room and adjacent parlour, Holmes inspecting the frames upon the wall and the titles on the bookshelf with the same attentiveness he had once applied to the charred corner of a murder note. He said little, but I observed the tension in his eyes. Not the excitement of a puzzle begun, but something quieter, more grave. At the base of the main staircase, I halted. There, nearly hidden in the curve of the balustrade, was a small wooden horse, the sort a child might draw along on a string. It was worn smooth with age, its red paint flaked to a ghostly pink, and in the hush of the house, I fancied I heard a note, not music, but something more elemental, a melody not played but remembered. Holmes looked up. "A tune," I said almost involuntarily. "Do you hear it?" He nodded. "A child's song, if I'm not mistaken, one that lives not in the air but in the walls." I glanced to the stair above us. It seemed to recede, not merely into darkness, but into memory itself. "There is grief here," I murmured, "but no mourning." Holmes's brow furrowed. "No mourning," he echoed, "and no dust upon the study door upstairs, though there is dust on every threshold but that one." We stood a moment longer in that hallway, with the faded toy at our feet and the nursery rhyme, half sensed, half imagined, hovering in the space between. Holmes stepped past me without another word and began the ascent. We had not long resumed our survey of the lower floor when Miss Greywood arrived, having journeyed by the next train and walked from the lane alone. There was something in her bearing altered since our meeting in Baker Street. The apprehension had not left her, but it had ripened into something more solemn, as though entering Eastwood House had drawn into sharper focus a grief she had previously only intuited. She did not speak at once, but wandered into the drawing-room with the air of one retracing a vanished path. Holmes, standing by the window, made no remark, permitting her thoughts to gather unhurried. "It used to be brighter," she said at last. "Even with the curtains drawn, I remember the light always seemed to find its way in here, but I suppose that is a trick of memory, like thinking someone smiled when in truth they only looked away." Holmes turned, regarding her with his characteristically impassive attention. "There was a child," she continued, "though no one ever spoke of him directly. I think he was meant to be here only for the summer. I was perhaps 7 or 8. I remember hearing footsteps in the corridor above, light, hurried, and different from the adults. Once I caught a glimpse of him from the garden. He was watching from a landing window. But when I asked my governess who he was, she said I mustn't invent imaginary playmates." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "I had not invented him." Holmes nodded once, but said nothing. I sensed that he was measuring not merely her words, but the careful omissions between them. "There were rumours," she went on, though whispered, and always with a tone of finality that discouraged curiosity, that he had fallen ill or been taken away. But even at that age, I knew when something had been locked away, not lost. Her gaze had drifted toward the hallway beyond. There is something unnatural in how thoroughly he was forgotten, as though remembering him would tear open something best kept shut. You say you caught sight of him once, Holmes said gently. Was there anything unusual in his manner? Did he look afraid? She considered, then shook her head. No, not afraid. Just very still, as though he already knew he didn't belong. Holmes moved toward the hearth in the drawing room, stooping beside it without a word. His long fingers brushed aside a layer of soot with the delicacy of one opening a letter rather than examining a fireplace. "Doctor," he murmured, beckoning me forward. I joined him at once and saw, amidst the ashes, the unmistakable edge of scorched paper. Holmes lifted it delicately with his pocket knife, exposing the blackened remnants of several pages, each layered as if hastily pushed into the flames together. One corner remained unburnt, and I could just discern a portion of a word, the long loop of a capital G, and what might have been the tail of a Y or F. "Burned in haste," Holmes said quietly. "See how the edges curl unevenly, and yet, not recently. This charring has long since cooled. It dates, I should think, to the very season we are examining, the summer of 1876. He dropped the remains gently into his handkerchief. "It is not only people who vanish, Watson, it is their records, and the reason those records were ever written at all." He rose, and in his eyes I saw the rare expression he reserved for matters which had crossed beyond deduction into conscience. Without speaking further, he stepped out into the corridor once more. I followed, though not without glancing once more into the hearth, as though its ashes might still whisper something of what had been consigned to them. Holmes ascended the staircase with unhurried step, yet I could not shake the impression that something unseen pressed him forward. At the landing, he turned left, passing a series of closed doors whose brass handles bore the tarnish of decades. At the corridor's end stood a solitary door of darker oak, its surface unmarked, but for a faint ridge in the grain where a key had turned long ago. He paused but a moment. With quiet precision, he drew the iron key from his pocket and inserted it into the lock. The bolt resisted at first, not with obstinacy, but with reluctance. There was in the turning of that key something of ceremony, as though Holmes were not unlocking a room, but disturbing a pact made long ago with silence. The door creaked open. No draught stirred. No light spilt out. We stepped inside. The air within was cool and stale, yet not suffocating, the air of a place hermetically sealed rather than abandoned. The curtains were drawn, but enough grey daylight filtered in to reveal a study of solemn and disquieting order. Everything lay precisely where it must have been placed decades prior. A decanter of brandy stood half full beside an untouched glass. A coat, dark and formal, hung on a solitary peg near the door. Even the inkstand on the writing desk retained the thick crust of dried black, undisturbed. Holmes did not speak. He moved to the desk as a priest to an altar, reverent not of the object, but of the act it had witnessed. It was a fine old roll-top desk, its curved lid covered in a film of dust, so even that I hesitated to disturb it. Holmes, however, rolled it back without hesitation. The desk yielded with the same weary sigh as the door, exposing an orderly series of pigeonholes and compartments, each labelled in a narrow, meticulous script. To our astonishment, the contents were largely undisturbed. There were ledgers, bills of account, and folded correspondence, many in envelopes bearing no stamp. Holmes drew one out and unfolded it carefully. "Unsent," he remarked, yet clearly addressed. The letter bore a date, July 7th, 1876, and a salutation to Miss I. Halberton, the governess. Though its tone was not professional, the handwriting began in a neat copperplate, but deteriorated markedly by the third paragraph, as though the writer's nerve, or hand, had faltered. Another letter, tucked behind the first, bore no address. It opened simply, "I have tried to forget, but the child's voice lingers." Holmes's expression did not change, but I could sense the current of thought behind it, a slow piecing together of elements once scattered by design. "These were written not for the eyes of others," he said, more to himself than to me. "And yet they were not destroyed. They were placed here, within easy reach of the man who, day by day, chose not to post them." He reached for a third letter but paused as his eye caught something in the uppermost drawer, a corner of folded paper peeking from beneath a bound folio. It was not a letter, it was a child's drawing. The page had yellowed at the edges, and the crayon had faded to the faintest of hues, but the subject was unmistakable. It was a house, squat and square, with 4 windows and a door, rendered in a childish hand. In the upper left, a sun beamed down in pale orange. Near the door stood 2 stick figures, one tall and dark, the other small and blue. There was something affecting in the innocence of it, something that clung to the heart in a way logic could not dislodge, but it was the third figure, barely visible and drawn behind the lower panes of the house, that arrested me. It was a face, round, indistinct, and without body, 2 circles for eyes and a curved line for a mouth. But it was placed not in play, nor as part of a happy household scene. It was drawn behind a window and coloured in grey. "A child's memory," I said softly. "Or a warning." Holmes studied the paper without touching it. "Or both," he said. "But one thing is clear. This was not meant to be kept. And yet, it was." Holmes turned next to the ledgers. These too were arranged with fastidious care, recording household accounts that stretched across several years. He moved through them quickly, his eye darting from column to margin until his hand stilled. "Here," he murmured. He passed me the ledger, open to a page marked June 21st, 1876. The entries for that day were routine: bread, lamp oil, firewood. But one line stood out. It was set apart, written in a different hand, and unaccompanied by any sum. June 21st, the night she never left. No context, no elaboration, only that single, enigmatic sentence. "She?" I asked. "Miss Greywood." Holmes shook his head. "No, not Eliza, not at that time." He traced the words with a fingertip. This ledger was not a diary. Its author did not indulge in metaphor or poetry elsewhere. This note, this deviation, must have been a confession of sorts, written, perhaps, at a moment when the truth could no longer be borne silently. He closed the ledger and placed it carefully on the desk. Let us suppose the household believed the child had departed, and yet this line, "she never left," stands in contradiction. It is not a record of departure, but of presence, a presence denied or concealed. A silence settled between us. Then Holmes said, almost absently, "We must examine the ink." Holmes drew a small case from his coat and applied a minute quantity of reagent to the paper. The ink shimmered faintly under his lens. Faded walnut, iron gall. But this application, he paused. This was laid down after the summer heat had begun to lift. Notice how the pen hesitates at the corners, written with a hand not in secrecy, but in shame. He tested a second letter, the one addressed to the governess. "Identical composition," he said. "And the paper itself? Heavier stock, local, not cheap, but not intended for formal correspondence either." He turned the page in his hand and tapped the back with his finger. "See the watermark, Greywood House." "These were written for no one but the author," I said. "Not quite," Holmes replied. They were written for someone, but with the knowledge that they would never be read. He returned the pages gently to the drawer. To write a letter one intends to burn is one thing, but to write a letter and then hide it, carefully, deliberately, is another altogether. He looked once more at the ledger, then back at the drawing, now resting upon the desk's surface. "There is no forgetting, Watson," he said quietly. "There is only delay." We had returned to the drawing room, the light outside thinning as clouds amassed, and the distant rumble of an approaching storm announced itself in low reverberations across the Suffolk hills. Miss Greywood sat across from Holmes in the armchair that had once served her great-uncle, though she seemed a visitor still, not only to the house, but to her own memories. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his long fingers templed in silent reflection. Then, with the gentlest of tones, he said, "Tell me, Miss Greywood, when last you visited Eastwood House as a child, was there anyone else here of your age?" She looked up, blinking. No," she said slowly. "No one close to my age, at least. Not a companion, a cousin perhaps, or child of a servant. There were no children here, only myself." "None you recall?" Holmes said softly. "Or none you were told to forget?" She opened her mouth, then faltered. "There was," she began, and then stopped. Holmes did not press her. He let the pause speak, and when she recovered, her voice was thinner. "There was a summer, I was very young, when I thought there might have been someone else. I remember hearing laughter in the orchard. I thought it was mine, until I realized I hadn't laughed. But my governess scolded me for inventing stories. I was often told I had a vivid imagination." "And the name?" Holmes asked gently. "Did you ever hear it?" Her brow furrowed. "I believe it began with an E, but I never learned the rest." Holmes met my eyes across the room, and in that instant I knew something had been half remembered or half erased. It was not long afterward that we uncovered a record more steadfast than memory. In the attic, tucked among housekeeper's logs and estate expense books, we found a narrow volume marked Nursery, Summer 1876. Its cover was curled with age, and the pages bore the brittle gloss of a long-dried ink. Holmes opened it upon the old writing table near the landing window. "Observe, Watson," he said, tapping the columns with a practised hand. Each entry listed the daily linen tally, the number of meals sent up, and the beds occupied on the nursery floor. "June 12th, 6 trays," I read. "June 14th, 6 again. Now," Holmes said, "note this." He turned the page to the week following midsummer. The entries shifted subtly. "June 21st, 7 trays." I raised an eyebrow. "An error?" "Unlikely. Mrs. Daltrey, the housekeeper at the time, was known for a mind like a ledger. She did not record phantoms. But there were only 6 family members here at the time, were there not?" "Precisely. 6 beds accounted for, yet 7 trays delivered, and on the following day we returned to 6. Could it have been a guest? If so, they came without luggage, departed without a name, and were never spoken of again." He closed the book gently, as though the very paper might crumble if challenged. "There was another child in this house, Watson," he said, "and someone took very deliberate care to see that no one remembered him, save perhaps in ink too dry to erase." Later that day, while Holmes studied the library shelves, I wandered into a corridor on the second floor lined with oil portraits, faded likenesses of Greywoods long buried, their frames lacquered with dust and neglect. It was near the end of this gallery that I paused. A smaller canvas hung slightly askew, its frame narrower, its subject evidently a child. Yet the face was gone, not weathered, not faded, scrubbed. The strokes were deliberate. The rest of the painting remained intact. A boy's form in a dark coat, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, the suggestion of curls about the ears. but the head was a pale smear of brushwork. The colour lifted as though by thumb and cloth. Who would mutilate such a portrait? And why not remove it altogether? I called Holmes. He studied it silently for several moments. An erasure, he murmured, but not one of paint, one of presence. He glanced at me sidelong. They could destroy the child's likeness, he said, but not their memory of him. So they buried both beneath civility and silence. Back in the study, Holmes had resumed his examination of the desk drawers. He now held in hand a small folio of letters tied loosely with blue ribbon. They bore no envelope, no date, and were penned in a hand unfamiliar to me. He read one, then another, and then passed one across the desk. "Read this aloud, if you please, Watson." I complied, noting the affectionate tone, the almost childish phrasing, and the recurring signature. E.g. Could they be Eliza's? I asked. Holmes shook his head. The dates within them speak to a time at least 3 years prior to her birth. Moreover, the style, the idiom, belongs to an adolescent, not the pen of a young woman to her guardian, but of a boy writing to his older brother. He sifted through the letters again. There are references to summer rides, to the piano in the east parlour, to the orchard, all consistent with Eastwood House in the year 1876. He tapped the ribboned bundle against his palm. "I believe, Watson, that we have in these letters the voice of the one who signed them. E.g. Edward Greywood," Holmes said quietly, "a name erased by omission, but one not quite lost." For a time, neither of us spoke. The storm beyond the house had broken at last, and rain tapped softly against the upper panes. Holmes stood, moved to the hearth, and folded his arms. "There was a child," he said, "born, I suspect, of a liaison deemed improper, a half-brother to Eliza's great-uncle. That child, Edward, was brought here one summer, likely at the behest of the older brother who meant to do right by him, quietly. But something occurred," I said. Holmes nodded. "Something that rendered Edward's presence a threat, not to physical safety but to succession. He may have had a legitimate claim, or more dangerously still, he may have reminded someone of a past they wished to forget." I sat down slowly. "You believe he was harmed?" "I believe," Holmes said, his voice soft but firm, "that he never left." His eyes moved to the marred portrait outside. "And someone, perhaps more than one, spent the rest of their life preserving the illusion that he never arrived at all. I had grown accustomed during our stay at Eastwood House to the peculiar silence that lingered in its upper passages, not merely the hush of disuse, but something more withheld, as if the walls themselves held breath. It was in one such corridor, narrow and dim with the dust of years, that I found myself drawn to a section where the wainscoting buckled faintly and a tapestry hung askew. The fabric, a faded rendering of woodland stags, and heraldic flourish, appeared too heavy for the frail brass hooks that strained to hold it. Acting on no impulse more forceful than idle curiosity, I lifted it aside. Behind it, set within the plasterwork, was a narrow alcove, and within the alcove, a portrait. It was small, no more than 12 inches across, and framed in oak dull to the colour of ash. The canvas bore the unmistakable air of a work half remembered, not grandly commissioned, but privately undertaken, perhaps by a household member or a guest of moderate skill. The subject was a child, no older than 7, seated in a high-backed chair before a window. The light in the painting fell oddly, as if from the wrong direction, and the expression on the child's face, half smile, half stillness, unsettled me in a way I could not immediately name. It was not a portrait meant to commemorate achievement or delight a parent's eye. It had the look, rather, of something painted out of necessity, and hidden, I now saw, for very much the same reason. Holmes came at once when I called to him, and studied the portrait with a narrowness of gaze I had come to associate with evidence most damning. "Observe, Watson," he said, tapping the lower right corner of the canvas with a gloved finger. "Here, A signature. I leaned closer. The name had been rendered in fine, almost calligraphic hand. I, Halberton, the governess. I presume, I said, she painted it herself. Unquestionably, Holmes replied. The line has confidence, pressure consistent, a practiced wrist. Someone accustomed to detail but without formal training. It was likely completed over several days, perhaps weeks, with the sitter at some emotional remove. He shifted slightly, then pointed to the opposite corner. But this, he added, is something else. The second signature, half faded and tilted awkwardly along the edge, read E. Greywood. The ink here was different, newer, darker, and slightly bled into the weave of the canvas. The lettering lacked the poise of the first, and bore the telltale stutters of hesitation in its execution. Holmes's eyes sharpened. It is not the name that troubles me, he said. It is the hand. He stepped back, arms folded. One of these was inscribed by the woman who painted the portrait. The other, years later, by someone who wished it believed that he had sat for it. A child claiming himself as the sitter? No, Holmes said quietly. An adult claiming the child. Holmes returned to the desk and produced a small magnifying lens, which he trained upon the second inscription with the same gravity he once afforded the scarlet smudge that proved a sailor's alibi. Note the pressure here, he said. In the downstroke of the G, it cuts deeper than the others. And this, the tail of the Y in Greywood, rises unevenly, not from poor control, but from unfamiliarity. The hand mimics the form without truly knowing it. Not the signature of someone naming himself, I said slowly. Holmes nodded, but of someone attempting to name the child retroactively, or, more precisely, attempting to name the child as someone other than he was. He lowered the lens. This was not meant to honour the past. It was meant to correct it. I felt a chill at those words. Not the type that chills the skin, but the kind that settles lower, into the place where conscience dwells. Holmes stepped back from the frame. And yet, even in forgery, there remains confession. It was not merely the signature or the forgery that troubled Holmes, however. He spent a long moment studying the face of the child, a face rendered with care, yet strangely devoid of light. There was a peculiar reserve in the eyes. The smile, if it could be called that, lacked the spontaneous curve of joy. It was more a concession, a learned expression perhaps, but not a natural one. Holmes reached toward the frame and gently tilted it, allowing the afternoon light to shift across the surface. There is discomfort here, he said. See how the shoulder turns inward. The hands are not relaxed. One grips the armrest as if for support. And the gaze, I added. It's not directed at the painter. No, said Holmes, stepping back. It looks slightly away, not as though the child were distracted, but as though he were forbidden to meet her eyes. I swallowed. Do you suppose he was afraid? I suppose, Holmes answered, that he was uncertain whom to trust, and that uncertainty, Watson, is rarely born of innocence alone. Holmes stood for some time in silence, then turned from the painting with a slowness that bespoke thought unspoken. This false signature, he said at last, was not an act of vanity. It was an intervention. By whom? That, Holmes replied, remains to be seen. But consider, Watson. When memory becomes an inconvenience, the first thing to be altered is the record. The second is the witness. I looked again at the painting, the brushwork, the posture, the uneasy eyes. And the third? I asked. The name, he said, and gently touched the ink letters that had been laid to rewrite the truth. The portrait had scarcely been returned to its alcove when Holmes, without a word, beckoned me toward the stair. I followed, recognizing in his bearing that peculiar momentum he acquired when certainty had not yet crystallized into proof, and yet all remaining pieces had begun to tremble into place. We made our way to the estate office, a cramped chamber at the rear of the house, where the windows had long since clouded with dust, and the desk bore the sepulchral neatness of a place no longer touched by living hands. Holmes lit a candle with a match from his coat and began methodically scanning the ledgers stored on the lower shelves. These, he said, selecting a slim green-bound volume, were kept by the gardener. Unlike memory, Watson, gardens do not lie, though they may go quiet. He flipped to the pages marked March through June, 1876. I leaned over his shoulder. The entries were thorough. Plantings, weather conditions, soil treatments, week after week of diligent notes. Then, abruptly, a blank. No lettuces sown after March, Holmes murmured. No potatoes laid. No summer beans. A silence of spades, and not a word as to why. He turned the page slowly. And here, in July, orchard unentered, cellar untouched. Miss Halberton requests we avoid the bins beneath the stairs until further instruction. He looked up at me. Watson, I think we must go below, not to find vegetables, but to see what else was left to rot in the dark. The door to the root cellar groaned as it opened, disclosing a chill that clung to the throat. A narrow stair led downward into earth-wall dimness, where bins for potatoes and preserves lined the sides like abandoned stalls in a forgotten stable. The air was stale, yet not unbreathable, heavy only with the weight of things unsaid. Holmes descended first, lantern in hand, his footfalls muted on the stone. I followed, noting the way he passed his beam along the ground, not randomly but with calculated intent. There, he said, indicating a section at the far end. Do you see it? At first, I did not, but then, yes, a subtle rise in the packed soil, as though the earth had once been disturbed and settled poorly upon itself. It formed no mound, no obvious shape, but in a room so long untouched, the difference was palpable. Holmes crouched and pressed his hand to the dirt. It was tamped down by a heavy tool, spade or boot most likely, but not recently. The moisture has long since equalized. From a corner, he fetched an old iron trowel and passed it to me. Let us begin. I hesitated, as one might before drawing open a grave, then knelt and began to dig. The earth was dense, but not resistant. It yielded with a strange softness, and within minutes I felt the trowel strike something other than stone. A fold of wool. I paused. Holmes knelt beside me now. Together we brushed the soil aside, revealing, layer by layer, the unmistakable form of a child. The small skeleton was wrapped carefully in a shawl, once ivory, now mottled with the stains of time. The limbs were drawn inward, hands folded as if in repose. I turned away for a moment, unable to speak. Holmes did not avert his gaze. A burial, he said quietly, but not one offered by church or priest, only by necessity and guilt. It was near midnight when Holmes sent a telegram to Scotland Yard, and by early afternoon the following day, Inspector Lestrade himself arrived at Eastwood House, his overcoat damp with London rain, and his temper, as always, primed by the inconvenience of the countryside. "You'd better not be wasting my time, Holmes," he grumbled, lighting a cigarette with a shake of his match. "I seldom invite Scotland Yard to dig up vegetables," Holmes replied. We led him down into the root cellar. I confess I watched his face more closely than the remains, for Lestrade, though not without imagination, had a habit of bracing himself against excess sentiment. But when the shawl was lifted back and the child's skull revealed beneath, something in his countenance altered. "I'll be," he muttered. "Lord save us." He knelt and examined the shallow grave with professional precision, but his movements lacked their usual brisk detachment. Holmes handed him the gardening ledger. "I'd wager you'll find the housekeeper's record omitted any illness, and the local doctor, if questioned, will confess he was not summoned during that summer at all." Lestrade rose slowly, his face paler than usual. "You're saying someone killed the child?" "I am saying," Holmes answered, "that someone concealed the death, and the circumstances surrounding it may yet determine whether it was more than concealment." Lestrade looked around the cellar. "And who's responsible?" Holmes turned, his eyes dark with thought. That, Inspector, is what remains for us to exhume. Later that evening, as Lestrade made arrangements for the body to be removed under proper care, Holmes and I returned to the study. There, beneath lamplight, he spread the gardening ledger, the housekeeper's notes, and a separate account book from the same year. "Observe," he said, drawing his finger down the page. "Here, the governess's salary ceases in September of 1876, but she did not leave until the following spring, and here, a purchase of children's boots in June. Yet no child is listed in residence." He flipped another page. "And this, a payment to the coachman for evening errand to station, dated June 22nd. "The day after," I said. "Precisely. Now compare that to the falsified note in the ledger, the night she never left. Which begs the question, if the child never left, why pretend he had? Unless, of course, to maintain a fiction for the household, and perhaps for the law." He folded the pages slowly and looked up. "They created a timeline, Watson, a false one, with false departures and false silences, and one very vile death." "And now?" I asked. "Now," Holmes said, "we find the one who feared the truth most and persuaded everyone else to fear it with them." The following morning broke with a dull, heavy sky, that curious shade between pewter and ash so common in Suffolk at the edge of summer. A wind stirred little but the ivy clinging to the eastern side of the house, and even the birds, if any remained, kept their counsel. It was under such skies that the past seemed most willing to stir. Holmes had risen early. He had slept little, I suspect, though his energy was undiminished. After breakfast, he requested that Miss Ivy Halberton, long-retired governess and mistress of the East Wing, be informed that we would appreciate the courtesy of an audience. Her reply came without delay. She would see us in the green parlour. We were shown to the far side of the house, where the furniture had once been genteel, but now stood as it had for decades. Lacquer dulled, cushions faded to the colour of tea leaves, the scent of dried roses lingering in the drapes. In an armchair with high sides and fraying velvet sat Miss Halberton, a woman who might once have commanded the obedient silence of a schoolroom, and who still retained, in her stillness, a formidable dignity. She wore black, but not with ostentation. Her face was a delicate mask, thin, parchment-like skin stretched over sharp features, the eyes pale but unclouded. She rose, offered her hand to Holmes, and nodded once at me. "You have come to ask about the child," she said, before Holmes had spoken a word. Miss Halberton did not appear unsettled by our presence. Rather, she regarded us with the manner of one long prepared for a conversation long denied. She motioned for us to sit, and when we had done so, she folded her hands neatly in her lap. "He was unwell when he arrived," she said, though no one had spoken it aloud. "A thin child, timid, ill-favoured perhaps, but kind, quiet. He coughed in the mornings, and sometimes I found him asleep beneath the table." Her voice was perfectly modulated, each sentence measured as though recited from a passage once memorised and rehearsed. "He worsened in June, no fever but a persistent wheeze. I believed it best to keep him from the draughts. There was no physician. Your modern science would scold us, I dare say. But he passed peacefully. In the night, I found him before dawn." She paused then, not for breath, but as if to grant the moment its proper weight. Mr. Greywood feared scandal. There had been rumours, even then. The boy was buried privately. As you have no doubt discovered, the matter was not spoken of again. I watched her carefully, noting the complete absence of apology or emotion in her account. Not the detachment of cruelty, but of something else. Something more practised. "You believe," Holmes said gently, "that silence was a kindness." "I believe," she replied, "that the child was already forgotten by those who mattered most. I merely preserved the forgetting." Holmes remained very still during her recital. When she had finished, he did not respond at once, but studied her with an expression of careful neutrality, not dispassion, but the precision of a man separating sense from sentiment. "It is a difficult thing," he said quietly, "to recount death without reflection." Miss Halberton did not blink. "Reflection," she answered, "is a privilege of those who have no need to act." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "There is, however, such a thing as symmetry, in truth, as in fiction." To this, she said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed, her hands unmoving. Holmes continued, "Your account is remarkably even, the timing precise, the emotion subdued. I would expect a woman who had buried a child in haste, a child in her care, to falter, even slightly, in recalling it. But your narrative contains no gaps, no breath, no doubt, only symmetry." Still she did not waver. "And guilt?" he added. "Does that not disturb the pattern?" Her lips parted faintly. "Only if one believes another course was possible." Holmes stood slowly. "Then perhaps," he said, "we must revisit what was possible." He turned his back to her then, as though to signal the end of polite inquiry. "Dr. Watson," he said, as we made our way toward the hearth, "do you recall the fragments found in the drawing-room fireplace? Scorched pages, charred edges, possibly correspondence." Holmes nodded and dated to June of 1806. He now addressed Miss Halberton, who had neither moved nor spoken. "You stated the child died in his sleep, a natural death, that there was no physician, no investigation, no alarm. Yet why then was a fire lit at first light? And why were documents burned?" She said nothing. Holmes's tone did not rise, but it sharpened. "We found remnants of personal letters, possibly a will or a confession, burned hastily, though the weather was warm and the hearth unused for weeks prior. Who lit the fire, Miss Halberton?" Her composure did not crack, but her fingers now gripped the chair arm. "Someone sought to erase not the boy's body," Holmes continued, "but his connection to those who might have had reason to silence him." She breathed once, a sharp, involuntary thing. He let the silence hold. "Truth is not erased by fire," Holmes said finally. "It is only scorched into the memory of those who survived it." I had turned slightly, preparing to leave her in what I believed would be dignified retreat, when I noticed it. Miss Halberton, still poised, still outwardly composed, allowed her gaze, just once, to drift toward the far window. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but I had learned by then to attend such things. The window overlooked the eastern garden, and just beyond that, concealed by brush and long shadow, stood the cellar door. Holmes saw it too. "Not the study," he murmured. "Not the bedchamber. Not the garden path." He paused. "You looked at the door to the root cellar, Miss Halberton, and that is where the truth has long waited." Still she said nothing. Holmes stepped forward and bowed faintly. "We thank you for your time." And though her lips remained silent, the faintest quiver in her jaw, no larger than the motion of a leaf stirred by wind through glass, told me she had understood what silence could no longer protect. We did not speak much as we descended the corridor and crossed the tiled vestibule toward the study. The morning had turned, with deceptive swiftness, from muted grey to the sort of pale gold that flatters even the most austere of English facades. It warmed the stone of Greywood Hall, but not, I think, its conscience. The study had been sealed for decades, or so we were told, and yet Holmes had requested, the day prior, that it be reopened. The caretakers had obliged, though not without uneasy glances exchanged among them, as if the threshold of that room bore some ancestral disapproval. Now, Holmes entered it not as an investigator in pursuit of hard evidence, but as a mind reconstructing what only memory shame, and motive had thus far preserved. He stood by the window, the morning sun diffused through gauze curtains yellowed by time. A faint scent of ink, old wood, and lavender drifted from the volumes lining the shelves. Nothing in the room had been altered, not the worn armchair by the fire, nor the silver inkwell, nor the mahogany desk whose drawer he now opened without hesitation. Holmes held in his hand an ivory-handled letter opener, and with it idly stirred a sheaf of papers, as if listening for what rustled beneath memory. "Motive, Watson," he said softly, "has no need of brutality. It thrives quite well in silence." I glanced at the photograph of the elder Greywood sons that rested above the hearth. One smiled, the other did not. "There is a particular cruelty," Holmes said, still gazing upon the twin profiles in the faded photograph, "in crimes committed not for hatred, but for inheritance." I did not answer. His words had already drawn my mind to the boy we had unearthed in the root cellar, the child whose portrait had been defaced, whose name, even in death, had not been spoken with ease. Holmes resumed. "Edward was not killed in rage. He was not beaten, nor taken in illness. He was poisoned." My breath caught involuntarily. "Yes," Holmes said, "and not with the crude haste of arsenic or laudanum, but with a bitter tincture used in rare cases to quiet fevers of the blood. In small amounts, medicinal, in steady, measured doses, sufficient to still the heart." "And who?" I began. "His elder half-brother," Holmes said, "born of the first marriage, groomed for inheritance, then displaced by rumour and later certainty when a younger child arrived, one rumoured to be legitimate, though born of a liaison the family had taken great care to mask." I sat heavily upon the edge of a chair. "It was not malice," Holmes said, almost gently. "It was fear, the quiet, crushing fear of being erased, of becoming an illegitimate heir to a name which had once seemed destiny." I had heard Holmes pronounce guilt before, often with precision, sometimes with icy detachment, but never with such weight. He turned from the photograph and looked to the desk. "Fear, Watson," he said again, "can be the slowest poison of all." The ledger lay where it always had, neat, orderly, and carefully dusted. Its columns recorded household expenditures with the efficient elegance of an estate steward long since buried. Nothing in it had seemed amiss when first reviewed, but Holmes, who reads not only ink but silence, had requested it again. He flipped past the winter months and stopped abruptly at the entries for early June. "Here," he said, running a finger down the page, "one sees the regular purchase of tinned milk, barley water, linen, and coal oil. Then, here, a charge marked simply as tincture, local apothecary, 6 shillings 4 pence. The handwriting was not the same. It mimicked the steward's hand, but with just enough variation in the sweep of the T and the slope of the numbers to suggest forgery. "Clever," Holmes murmured, "but not clever enough. The steward died the week prior. This entry was inserted retroactively." "But why preserve it at all?" I asked. "Because," he replied, "even those who act in darkness crave the illusion of record. Some shred of justification, a ledger that says, 'Yes, I did this, and yet I wrote it down.'" He tapped the page once more. "It weeps between the lines, Watson. This is not a financial record. It is a confession dressed in numerals." I looked at the neat line of ink again, and for the first time, I saw it not as a record of expense, but as a monument to a moment when someone, somewhere in this house, chose silence over atonement. It was not Holmes who summoned Miss Halberton. She arrived of her own volition, quietly and without ceremony, and stood in the doorway as if she had always belonged to the shadows. She held in her hand a small iron key, unadorned, worn smooth by time. Her eyes did not flicker from Holmes's face. "I received this," she said, "the morning after the boy vanished. I was told to lock the study. I was told never to speak of what I had not seen. Holmes remained motionless. I believed, she continued, that it would pass. The scandal, the rumours, the grief. That silence would be enough to bury the shame. Watson's voice, my own, came before I could temper it. And you sealed the room? She nodded. I turned the key. I said nothing. I served the house. But not the child, I said. Her lips trembled. No, she whispered. Not the child. Holmes rose and took the key from her hand. He did not look at her with reproach, but neither did he spare her the full gravity of the moment. There are pacts, he said softly, that preserve reputation at the cost of truth, but time does not honour them. It only waits. Miss Halberton said nothing more. She turned and walked from the room, not in disgrace, but in quiet resignation, like a sentry dismissed long after the watch had ended. The fire had gone out in the hearth. A single draught moved through the curtains, and the ledger, still open on the desk, rustled faintly as though some hand had turned a page. Holmes remained by the window. He did not speak for some time. Then, slowly, he turned to me. We are accustomed, are we not, Watson, he said, to think of crime in terms of action, of knife, or revolver, or theft committed by force of hand. Yes, I said, but there are crimes that require no weapon, only neglect, only silence, only the fear of being unmade by the presence of another. He closed the ledger and placed the key beside it. This was such a crime. It drew no blood, made no sound, and yet it required a mind as calculated, as deliberate, as any villain we have faced. I studied his face, composed, but not cold. Will the law take it up? I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Perhaps, though I suspect the law will find itself several decades too late. There is no killer to hang, only a lineage to unmask. He looked at me. And yet, he added, I find no satisfaction in this conclusion. Why? I asked quietly. Because justice, Holmes said, was not denied by the criminal, but by those who chose silence and called it mercy. And with that, he turned once more to the fading light beyond the window, where truth, long buried, had begun, at last, to breathe. I had nearly closed the lid upon the desk when my hand, brushing against the rear panel of the lower drawer, encountered a faint irregularity, a ridge not accounted for by the carpentry of the rest. I paused, adjusted my angle, and with the careful pressure of thumb and forefinger, prized at what I now suspected to be a false bottom. The panel gave way with a soft click, revealing a cavity no deeper than a ledger's width. Within it lay a single envelope, its seal unbroken, its edges browned with time and the oils of long-abandoned touch. Across the front was written in a shaky, yet once practiced script, to be read only in the event of my death, and by no one whose name bears my own. I called Holmes, who had taken to pacing near the hearth. A concealed drawer, I said, holding the envelope delicately between two fingers. It appears untouched for decades. Holmes took it in silence, inspected the wax, a personal seal, greyed and dry, and nodded once. He did not open it there, but gestured for me to draw the curtains and light the oil lamp upon the desk. There are documents, he said, whose value lies not in their ink, but in the conscience they disturb. Let us see what this one dares disturb after so long a sleep. And with a deft flick of his penknife, he broke the seal and began to read. The parchment bore the impressions of a trembling hand, each letter shaped with the caution of one who fears his own memory, yet feels compelled to commit it to ink. The writing was dense, the lines uneven, and the first few words smudged as if the pen had hesitated in remorse. It is not justice I expect, Holmes began to read aloud, his voice low, deliberate. Nor absolution, but silence has never redeemed the guilty, and I find that silence is all that remains to me now. I drew nearer. My brother, the letter continued, trusted me with the stewardship of his affairs and his child, having passed unexpectedly while abroad. The child was legitimate, though conceived under circumstances the family sought to obscure. Her name was Lydia, and she bore the greywood eyes. In her, I saw both the end of my own expectations and the beginning of a truth I was not prepared to face. Holmes paused. The child he refers to, I said softly, must be Edward's mother. He inclined his head and read on. When Edward was born, I knew what the will would name him, the heir, the line renewed. I feared then what that would mean for me, not only in fortune, but in memory. I could not bear to be relegated to the shadow, to watch my place pass into the hands of a boy who would never know my sacrifices. The remainder trembled with a kind of dignity that only shame could preserve. I did not strike him. I did not scream. I simply placed the tincture in his tea. It was quiet, and when he fell ill, I wrote the account that was needed. Ivy sealed the room. The name was never uttered again. Holmes lowered the letter. It is not a confession, Watson. It is a reckoning. We stood in the deepening quiet of the study, the confession still trembling faintly in Holmes's hand. I had read much in my time as a physician, final testaments scrawled by soldiers, bedside murmurings of the dying, journals penned in the madness of grief. But there was something particularly mournful in this letter, not in its words alone, but in what they deferred. Holmes lifted the page once more and read the final lines aloud. To the one who bears her name, or the child of her body, if such a soul exists, I ask no forgiveness. I wish only that the truth not die with me. The fortune is theirs by right, and the shame is mine to carry, even in death. He looked up at me, his eyes unreadable. Eliza, I said. She was raised within the house, Holmes replied, but outside the circle of succession, a companion to the family, but never of it. A child whose presence was tolerated, perhaps even pitied, but never explained. He turned, walked to the mantelpiece, and rested the letter gently atop it. The name was not given, he said, but the clues lie strewn behind us. The altered portrait, the misplaced signature, the silence in the planting ledgers, the dates that no longer align. And the eyes, I added. Holmes nodded. Indeed, the greywood eyes, and with them the inheritance not only of blood, but of grief. There was a stillness between us then, of the sort that needs no language. We had unearthed not merely a crime, but a buried lineage, one that had sought erasure and failed. And in that failure, perhaps, a form of justice might begin to breathe. It was several days after our return to London that I found Holmes once more seated in the armchair by the hearth at 230B Baker Street, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin and his gaze fixed not on any newspaper or monograph, but on the slowly gathering fog outside the window. The lamps of the hansom cabs blurred like ghosts as they moved along Baker Street, and the coal fire behind him cast a soft glow over the table where the confession still lay, folded and weighted by a polished stone. He had spoken little since our departure from Eastwood House, save for a brief note to Inspector Lestrade and another, more private communication, the contents of which he did not share with me. I had taken to writing out my own notes on the case, though the task gave me no pleasure, and indeed felt more like a duty than a calling. There are crimes which, once solved, leave the mind braced and the soul restored. This was not one. Holmes's silence, however, was of a different kind, neither grim nor brooding, but rather thoughtful in that way peculiar to him, as though he were rearranging not facts but principles, weighing not suspects but the substance of justice itself. I suppose it is done, I said at last, though my voice betrayed some unease. The girl will inherit. Lestrade has the confession. The bones have been returned to consecrated earth. Holmes nodded faintly, his eyes not shifting from the pain. And yet, I added, it does not feel as though the matter is settled. He exhaled, not quite a sigh. "That is because, my dear Watson," he said quietly, "some matters are not designed for settlement, only for understanding. I cannot help but think," I began after a long pause, "of the loneliness of it all. A child buried beneath potatoes and ledgers, a confession inked too late, and a girl raised in the very house that denied her name. Loneliness," Holmes murmured, "is often the cost of silence." He turned to me then, eyes clear but heavy. "We are trained, you by Hippocrates, I by logic, to classify wrongs, to distinguish between error and crime. But in this case, what passed for justice was long delayed, and perhaps never fully delivered." I was silent. He continued, "The law, you see, concerns itself with the act. It draws a line, that which can be prosecuted and that which cannot. But guilt dwells elsewhere. It lives in the unlit corridors of the mind, where time corrodes memory, but never quite erases it." "And what of Miss Halberton?" I asked. "Do you believe she acted out of cruelty or of fear?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that she acted out of weariness, the weariness of an old loyalty held too long. The key she accepted, the room she sealed, the truth she never named, all speak not of malice, but of a conscience surrendered by degrees." "But surely," I ventured, "if one knows a wrong has been committed, one may still choose not to speak," Holmes finished, "and one may convince oneself that silence is a kindness." There was something unspeakably sad in his voice, though it passed as quickly as it came. "In such moments, Watson, we touch not the domain of law, but of mercy. And mercy, as you know, is rarely symmetrical." Holmes rose from his chair and approached the mantel, where the sealed confession lay. He placed one long finger upon it, then withdrew his hand, without opening the letter again. "It was not vengeance that brought us to Eastwood," he said, "nor even duty. It was the persistence of something small, a missing signature, a child's gaze, an unsown spring. A series of impressions too delicate to ignore, and yet too quiet to pursue through conventional means." I joined him at the window. Outside, the fog had thickened to the colour of chalk, and the street lamps now glowed like distant, ancient stars. The world beyond seemed hushed, as though holding its breath. "Will she ever know?" I asked. "Miss Greywood, of the truth, of the confession, the inheritance, the name?" "She may come to suspect it," Holmes replied, "but I doubt she will ever be told." "And you will not?" "I am not the arbiter of such things," he said simply. "There is a cruelty in truth, Watson, when it arrives too late to mend what it shatters. In some cases, it is better that the truth remains unspoken, but honoured." I said nothing for some time. Finally, he turned to me with a faint smile. "You see, my friend, not all crimes are punished, not all victims are named, but some memories, the right memories, must be preserved, precisely because they cannot be avenged." He returned to his seat, lit his pipe with quiet precision, and once again looked toward the window. And in that moment, beneath the gaslight, the smoke, and the silence, I understood that we had solved a mystery. Yes, but we had also borne witness to something else, the endurance of sorrow, and the rare, strange dignity of a mercy withheld. As the last pages of the confession were laid gently beside the candle, Holmes turned to the window, where the fog of Baker Street drifted like the fading breath of a dream long withheld. "There are crimes, Watson," he said quietly, "that neither judge nor jury shall ever touch, not because they are hidden, but because they are folded inside the hearts of those who commit them. In such cases, it is not justice that fails, but humanity that must choose between punishment and mercy." I said nothing. The silence between us spoke more than any verdict. What do you believe was the deeper betrayal in this tale, the murder itself, or the years of silence that followed? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one, and if you'd like more cases that linger in the shadows of the mind, Do subscribe and pass this mystery along to a fellow seeker of truths.